Hello everyone. I'm here to help you today. I know you're using this video to sleep. So before that, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now, sit back and relax. My name is Vera Castellanos, and 6 months ago, I never would have believed that information could rot. Not metaphorically, actually decay like organic matter, breaking down into something fundamentally wrong. I was a data archaeologist, which sounds more impressive than it is. Mostly, I digitized old corporate records for law firms handling estate disputes. Tedious work, decent pay. The kind of job that lets you afford a studio apartment in a city that's slowly pricing out anyone without family money or venture capital funding. I had neither. The Kempervoss assignment came through my usual contractor, a litigation support firm called Barstead and Associates. They'd used me before for standard document recovery, converting ancient filing systems into searchable databases, extracting value from decades of accumulated paper. This job seemed straightforward enough. A deceased executive's personal papers, stored in a private archive facility outside the city. The family needed everything cataloged before they could settle the estate. Standard billable hours, a rush fee because they wanted it done in 2 weeks, and the promise of a completion bonus if I met the deadline. I should have asked why the previous contractor had quit after 3 days. The Silverwood Archive sat 40 minutes west of the city, past the sprawl of outlet malls and storage facilities that marked the urban periphery. The building itself looked like a converted warehouse from the outside. Corrugated metal siding painted a dusty beige, small windows set high in the walls. A discreet bronze plaque beside the entrance read, S. 1978, private collections only. The parking lot held maybe 8 cars, scattered across spaces marked by faded yellow lines that had oxidized to near invisibility under years of sun exposure. Inside, the reception area struck me as aggressively neutral. Beige carpet, beige walls, cream-colored furniture that looked expensive but deliberately inoffensive. A woman in her 50s sat behind a reception desk constructed from what appeared to be burnished aluminum and frosted glass. She wore a navy cardigan over a white blouse, reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain around her neck. Everything about the space suggested discretion. The kind of environment where wealthy families stored things they didn't want destroyed but couldn't bear to keep close. Ms. Castellanos, the receptionist smiled without showing teeth. We've been expecting you. Mr. Kemper's collection is in Archive Room 7. I'll have someone escort you. She pressed a button on her desk phone, speaking too quietly for me to hear. A minute later, a young man in khakis and a polo shirt appeared from a hallway to my left. He had the bland, scrubbed appearance of someone working their first job out of college, still uncertain whether this position was a career or just a placeholder. "I'm Derek," he said, offering a hand. His grip was exactly firm enough, practiced, corporate. "I'll show you to your workspace. Do you have everything you need, or can we provide any equipment?" "I brought my own scanner and laptop," I said. "Just need access to power outlets and a decent work surface." "Room 7 has both." Derek swiped a keycard through a reader beside an unmarked door. It clicked open, revealing a corridor painted the same oppressive beige as the reception area. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that particular frequency that becomes invisible until someone points it out, and then you can never stop noticing it. The Kemper collection arrived 3 weeks ago. It's extensive. I think the family underestimated how much material there was. We passed several numbered doors, archive rooms 1 through 6, before stopping at the 7th. Derek swiped his card again. The door opened onto a space roughly the size of a single-car garage. Metal shelving units lined 3 walls, stuffed with bankers' boxes, all labeled with neat printed tags. A folding table stood in the center of the room, 2 folding chairs tucked beneath it. A power strip had been mounted to the table's edge, its cord snaking across the floor to a wall outlet. The room smelled of old paper and something else, something slightly acrid that I couldn't immediately identify. "There's a bathroom down the hall," Derek said, "and a break room with coffee and a microwave if you need it. Building hours are 7 a.m. to 10 p.m., but you'll have keycard access to your room 24/7 in case you want to work late. Just remember to log your hours in the sign-out sheet at reception." He handed me a keycard, this one attached to a lanyard with the Silverwood Archive logo, a stylized tree composed of filing cabinet drawers. I examined the card. It had my name printed on it, along with an ID number and an expiration date 3 weeks out. "Questions?" Derek asked. "Internet access. Guest network password is on the whiteboard by the break room." He gestured vaguely back toward the corridor. "Anything else?" "I'm good, thanks." He left me there, the door clicking shut with a pneumatic hiss that suggested hermetic seals, climate control, the kind of environmental regulation required for long-term document preservation. I set my laptop bag on the table and surveyed the shelving units. 63 boxes, I counted, each labeled with a date range and a cryptic alphanumeric code that meant nothing to me yet, but would presumably make sense once I started sorting through the contents. The earliest box was dated 1963-1967. The most recent, 2019-2021. Almost 60 years of accumulated documentation. I did the math. If each box took me 4 hours to process, I was looking at 252 hours of work. At 8 hours a day, that was 31 days. I had 14. I pulled down the first box and opened it. Inside, file folders organized with obsessive precision, each one labeled with a typed index card, the kind produced by an actual typewriter. I could see the slight misalignment of letters, the heavier impression where keys had struck with more force. The first folder contained correspondence, letters on business letterhead, all addressed to or from someone named Harrison Kemper. The dates matched the box label, September 1963 through March 1964. I began photographing pages with my portable scanner, a document camera that captured high-resolution images fast enough to keep pace with my ability to turn pages. The letters were mundane. Business negotiations for medical equipment supply contracts. Kemper appeared to have been some kind of distributor, a middleman connecting manufacturers with hospitals and clinics. The language was formal, stuffy in the way business correspondence used to be before email stripped away pretense and forced everyone into casual efficiency. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth the rush fee and completion bonus. I worked through the first box in 3 hours, cataloging each document, creating a searchable index with keywords and date ranges. By the time I finished, my neck ached from hunching over the scanner, and the fluorescent lights had given me the beginnings of a headache. I checked my phone. 4:47 p.m. I could probably knock out one more box before the building closed. The second box contained more correspondence, now spanning 1967-1970. The tone shifted slightly. Kemper's business was expanding. He'd moved from simple distribution into consulting, advising hospitals on equipment procurement and facility design. The letters referenced site visits, recommendations for X-ray departments and surgical suites. Kemper had opinions about everything: radiation shielding, ventilation systems, even the psychological impact of wall colors on patient recovery times. One letter, dated August 1969, caught my attention. It was from a Dr. Nathaniel Voss, the other name in the company designation, responding to something Kemper had apparently said during a consultation visit. The tone was defensive. "I must respectfully disagree with your assessment regarding the necessity of isolation protocols in the proposed psychiatric ward," Voss wrote. "While I appreciate your concerns about patient containment, modern therapeutic approaches emphasize integration rather than segregation. The days of hiding the mentally ill in basement rooms are, I believe, behind us." Kemper's response, dated 2 weeks later, was measured but firm. "I defer to your medical expertise, Dr. Voss, but I must insist that certain architectural considerations remain non-negotiable. The specifications I provided are not merely suggestions. They are requirements based on extensive research into optimal patient management environments. I trust you will implement them as designed." The exchange interested me primarily because it suggested tension between the two men. The company was called Kemper Voss, implying partnership, but these letters read like a hierarchy with Kemper on top. I made a note in my index: potential partnership conflict, and continued scanning. By 6:50, I'd finished the second box and started a third. This one contained blueprints, rolled and stored in cardboard tubes that had been flattened to fit the banker's box dimensions. I unrolled the first one carefully, weighing down the corners with my laptop and phone. It showed a floor plan for a psychiatric facility: patient rooms, common areas, administrative offices. Dated 1971. The layout was strange: too many corridors leading nowhere, rooms positioned in ways that seemed to maximize isolation rather than facilitate care. Several areas were shaded in pencil and marked "restricted access." No explanation for what made them restricted. I photographed the blueprint in sections, stitching the images together digitally. As I worked, I noticed something odd. The walls were unusually thick in certain areas, far thicker than seemed necessary for simple sound insulation. And the restricted access rooms had no windows, no ventilation grills visible on the plans, just solid walls and single-point entry doors. Maybe it was a security feature. Maybe these were rooms designed for violent patients, people who might hurt themselves or others. That would explain the isolation, the heavy construction. But the shading bothered me. It was hasty, aggressive, the kind of mark someone makes when they're angry or frustrated, not the neat, professional annotations that covered the rest of the blueprint. I finished photographing the plans around 7:30. My eyes burned from screen glare, and the headache had developed into a steady throb behind my left eye. Time to call it a day. I repacked my equipment, stacked the process boxes in a completed section I designated at the far end of the shelving unit, and headed for the door. The keycard reader blinked green when I swiped, and the pneumatic seal released with its characteristic hiss. I stepped into the corridor and froze. The lights were different, still fluorescent, still that oppressive overhead brightness, but the color was wrong. Instead of the neutral white I'd noticed earlier, they cast a faint amber tint, like light filtered through old paper. And the hallway seemed longer than I remembered, the door to the reception area distant in a way that didn't match my mental map of the space. I stood there for maybe 15 seconds, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I expected. Then I blinked, and everything snapped back to normal. White lights, corridor the correct length, the door to reception exactly where it should be. Fatigue, I decided. I strained, making me see colors that weren't there, distorting my depth perception. I needed to eat something, take some ibuprofen, get a decent night's sleep. Derek was still at reception, now reading something on his phone. He looked up when I approached. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Good, made decent progress. I'll be back tomorrow around 8. "Great." He made a note on a clipboard. "Oh, quick thing. Don't leave any food in your room overnight. We've had issues with pests in the past, and the exterminator is expensive." "No problem. I don't usually eat while I work." "Perfect. See you tomorrow." I drove home through the kind of suburban sprawl that all looks identical after dark. Strip malls and chain restaurants. Traffic lights cycling through their sequences for mostly empty roads. My apartment smelled stale when I unlocked the door, the air motionless from being sealed up all day. I opened a window, microwaved some leftovers, took 3 ibuprofen, and collapsed into bed by 9:30. I dreamed about corridors, long ones stretching beyond sight, lined with numbered doors that opened onto rooms that were somehow all the same room, repeated infinitely, each one containing slightly different furniture arranged in slightly different configurations, but all clearly variations on a single template. I walked from door to door, trying to understand the pattern, but every time I thought I'd identified the organizing principle, the next room violated it. When I woke at 6:15, I felt more tired than when I'd gone to sleep. The second day started normally. Derek was already at reception when I arrived, this time accompanied by the older woman from yesterday. They were discussing something in low voices, but stopped when I entered. "Morning," I said. "Morning," Derek smiled his corporate smile. "All set?" "Yep, just need coffee from the break room." "Help yourself. Fresh pot should be ready." The break room was exactly what I expected. White walls, linoleum floor, counters lined with a coffee maker, a microwave, and a small refrigerator. A whiteboard mounted above the coffee maker displayed the Wi-Fi password in neat dry erase handwriting. Silverwood 2024 archive. I poured a cup, generic medium roast, slightly burnt from sitting on the warming plate, and headed to room 7. The keycard reader blinked green, the door opened, and I stopped. The boxes had been rearranged. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be immediately obvious to someone who hadn't spent hours familiarizing themselves with the space, but I'd left 3 boxes in my completed section yesterday. Now there were 4, and the box I'd been working on, the one with blueprints, was no longer on the table where I'd left it. Instead, it sat on a shelf in the middle section, surrounded by boxes I hadn't touched yet. I stood in the doorway, coffee cooling in my hand, trying to generate a reasonable explanation. Maybe Derek had come in to do some kind of inspection. Maybe there was a filing system I wasn't aware of, some protocol that required completed boxes to be stored in a specific configuration. But that didn't explain the blueprint box being moved. I'd specifically left it out because I wasn't finished with it. I set my coffee down and checked the completed boxes. The first 2 I'd processed yesterday were there, right where I'd put them. The third box, the one I didn't remember completing, contained correspondence from 1970 to 1974. I opened it and scanned the first few folders. They were processed. Every page photographed, logged in my index file with timestamps and keywords. I checked my laptop. The index confirmed it. Box 3, Correspondence 1972-1974, processed yesterday between 7:35 p.m. and 9:43 p.m. But I'd left by 7:30. I was certain of that. I remembered checking the time, remembered the drive home, remembered eating and going to sleep early. The timestamps had to be wrong. Some kind of synchronization error between my camera and laptop. Files getting marked with creation dates that didn't match reality. It happened sometimes when devices had different time zone settings. I checked my camera's timestamp, correct. Laptop system clock, correct. Both set to automatic synchronization via internet connection. The files in box 3 were definitely mine. I recognized my scanning technique, the consistent framing and resolution, but I had no memory of creating them. I sat down at the table, opened box 3 and started spot-checking documents against my digital index. Everything matched. 47 folders, 1,263 pages, all cataloged with my standard keyword structure. The work was thorough, consistent with my usual quality. But I hadn't done it. Had I? Memory is unreliable. I'd been tired, headachy, working in poor lighting. Maybe I'd pushed through another box without fully registering the effort, my hands operating on autopilot while my consciousness drifted. That would explain the missing time. Dissociation, a mild fugue state brought on by exhaustion and repetitive work. It bothered me more than it should have, but I had a deadline, and sitting here trying to reconstruct yesterday's timeline wouldn't help me meet it. I pulled down box 4 and got to work. This box contained financial records, ledgers, balance sheets, tax documents. Kemper Voss had been profitable, very profitable, through the 1970s. The consulting business had expanded beyond individual hospital projects into large-scale psychiatric facility design. They'd worked on at least 15 major institutions across 6 states. The revenue numbers were substantial, especially for a 2-person firm. Except it wasn't a 2-person firm anymore. A memo dated March 1975 announced the addition of 2 new partners, Dr. Raymond Thorne and Dr. Alice Marchant. Both were psychiatrists, apparently brought in to provide additional medical expertise as the company's focus narrowed toward psychiatric facility design specifically. Another memo, this one from September 1975, referenced something called the Standardization Initiative. Kemper had written it, distributed to all partners. Effective immediately, all facility designs will incorporate the baseline specifications developed during our consultation with the Underhill project. These specifications are proprietary and confidential. Client facilities will benefit from our research into optimal patient management environments, and we will benefit from the consistency and efficiency of standardized design implementation. The Underhill project. I made a note of it, added it to my keyword index, and kept scanning. Over the next several folders, I found references to Underhill scattered throughout correspondence and financial documents. It was clearly important, lucrative contracts, significant research expenditures, but the details remained vague. Whatever the Underhill project was, it wasn't documented in this box. By noon, I'd processed 2 more boxes and started a 6th. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, and I was overdue for lunch, but I'd hit a productive rhythm and didn't want to break it. The boxes were starting to blur together. Correspondence, financial records, blueprints, more correspondence. All of it meticulously organized, all of it documenting Kemper Voss's steady expansion through the late 1970s and into the 1980s. Box 6 contained something different. The folders in this box weren't labeled with typed index cards. Instead, they had handwritten tabs, the ink faded but still legible, and the contents weren't business correspondence. They were personal notes, journal entries, what looked like draft versions of letters that had never been sent. The first entry was dated January 3, 1978. Harrison Kemper's handwriting was precise, almost architectural in its geometric consistency. Voss continues to resist the implementation protocols, arguing that they compromise therapeutic efficacy. He doesn't understand, perhaps cannot understand, that efficacy is not the primary objective. The facilities must function as designed. The patients are not the point. They never were. I read that 3 times, trying to extract a meaning that made sense in context. Hospitals existed to treat patients. Psychiatric facilities existed to help people with mental illness. That was their purpose, their function. What else could efficacy mean in this context? I photographed the page and moved to the next entry. January 17, 1978. Marchant has submitted her resignation. Another one who couldn't grasp the scope. She claims ethical concerns as if ethics were relevant to architectural necessity. Thorne will stay. He understands, or at least he's willing to pretend he does. That's sufficient. January 30, 1978. The Underhill model is complete. 17 facilities now operating on standardized specifications. The consistency is remarkable. The geometry functions exactly as predicted. Voss has stopped arguing, though I suspect he's begun documenting his objections. Let him. Documentation doesn't matter. The buildings are what matter. They're self-sustaining now. I stopped scanning and sat back in my chair. The language Kemper was using, geometric necessity, self-sustaining, didn't sound like business communication. It sounded like someone describing an experiment or a mathematical proof. Buildings weren't self-sustaining. They required maintenance, utilities, human operation. Unless he was speaking metaphorically. Maybe Kemper was just a strange writer, someone who applied technical language to mundane concepts, because that's how his brain processed information. Some people were like that, engineers and architects who saw systems and structures in everything. But the comment about patients not being the point troubled me. I thought about those blueprints I'd scanned yesterday, the rooms with unusually thick walls and no apparent ventilation. The restricted access areas that seemed designed to isolate rather than treat. I continued through the journal entries. They became more fragmented, less coherent. February 14, 1978. The geometry is replicating. We didn't design it to do that. Or did we? I can't remember now which specifications were intentional and which emerged from the pattern itself. February 28, 1978. Visited the Millbrook facility yesterday. The patients were fine. By fine, I mean stable, unchanging. They've reached equilibrium. That's what the geometry does, it creates stable states. Voss says this is inhumane, but humanity is just another variable, one we can optimize for if necessary. Currently, it's not necessary. March 15, 1978. I've been reviewing the Underhill documentation, trying to understand what we actually accomplished there. The notes are incomplete. No, that's not quite right. The notes are complete, but they describe something that shouldn't be possible. We designed a building that designs itself. That can't be accurate, can it? The entries stopped after March 15. The rest of the folder was empty. I sat there, staring at the last page I'd photographed, trying to integrate this information into my understanding of the project. Kemper Voss had designed psychiatric facilities. That was established, documented in contracts and blueprints and financial records. But Kemper's personal notes suggested he'd viewed the work as something other than architecture. He wrote about the buildings as if they were active participants, as if the design itself had agency. Psychosis, maybe. Kemper might have been mentally ill, projecting meaning onto his work that existed only in his own deteriorating cognition. That would explain the fragmented syntax, the paranoid undertones. It would also explain why these journals were filed separately from business records. Someone, maybe family members settling the estate, had recognized them as evidence of illness rather than professional documentation. I checked the time, 2:47 p.m. I'd been working for almost 6 hours without a break. My neck was stiff, my eyes felt dry and abraded, and I was hungry enough that my hands had started to shake slightly. Time for lunch. I saved my work, locked my laptop in its bag, corporate security paranoia, even though I was the only person with keycard access to this room, and headed to the break room. The hallway was empty, the fluorescent lights humming their 60-cycle song. I walked past archive rooms 1 through 6, their doors closed and silent, no indication of whether anyone was working in them. The break room was also empty. I microwaved the sandwich I'd brought from home, turkey and cheese, wrapped in plastic that steamed and distorted as it heated, and sat at a small round table pushed against the wall. Through the window I could see the parking lot. Only 3 cars visible, mine, Derek's presumably, and a silver sedan I didn't recognize. I ate slowly, trying to think through what I'd read in Kemper's journal entries. The language bothered me, not just the content, that was disturbing in its own right, but the structure. Kemper wrote like someone who had started with clear thoughts and then watched them fragment in real time, syntax breaking down as his grip on coherent meaning slipped. I'd seen writing like that before, from people experiencing neurological decline or severe psychiatric episodes. But the dates bothered me. The entries covered only 3 months, January through March 1978. That was a short time frame for such dramatic cognitive deterioration. Alzheimer's and similar progressive conditions usually worked more slowly, and the entries themselves, while increasingly disjointed, never lost their technical precision. Kemper's handwriting remained consistent, his spelling and grammar intact even as his ideas became incomprehensible. My phone buzzed. A text from my contractor at Barstead and Associates. How's progress? I typed back, on schedule. Questions about some of the material though. Do you know what the Underhill project was? 3 dots appeared indicating a reply in progress. They disappeared, reappeared, disappeared again. Finally, no. Why? Referenced in several documents. Seems important, but details are vague. Another long pause before the response. Focus on cataloging, not content. Just need everything indexed for estate processing. Understood. I finished my sandwich, threw away the plastic wrapping, and returned to room 7. The door was open. I stopped 10 feet away, staring at the gap between door and frame. I had closed it. I specifically remembered closing it, checking that it latched properly before walking to the break room. The pneumatic seal required positive pressure to open. You couldn't just bump it or let it swing loose. I approached slowly, some instinct telling me to move carefully, to make noise so that anyone inside would know I was coming. The gap was maybe 3 inches wide, enough to see into the room but not enough to reveal its entire contents. "Hello," I called. No response. I pushed the door open fully and stepped inside. The boxes had been rearranged again, not just moved, reorganized according to some system I couldn't immediately parse. They were no longer in neat stacks on the shelves. Instead, they'd been distributed around the room in a pattern that seemed almost decorative, like someone had arranged them for aesthetic rather than functional purposes. Some sat on the floor, others remained on shelves, but at varying heights and distances that created a visual rhythm, a spacing that drew the eye around the room in a specific sequence. My laptop bag sat on the table, undisturbed. My completed boxes remained in their designated area, but the uncompleted boxes, the ones I hadn't processed yet, had been moved into this new configuration. I counted them, 58 boxes remaining, arranged in groups of 3, 7, and 11, repeated in a pattern that spiraled from the door toward the back corner of the room. 3 boxes near the entrance, then 7, then 11, then 3 again. The pattern repeated 4 times before running out of boxes. Someone had spent significant time on this. You don't randomly arrange 63 boxes into a mathematically precise spiral pattern. This was deliberate, purposeful. But why? I pulled out my phone and called Derek. He answered on the second ring. "Hey, everything okay? Has anyone else been in room 7 today?" A pause. "No, you're the only one with access." "Why?" "The boxes have been moved. Someone rearranged them while I was at lunch." "That's weird. Hold on, let me check the access logs." I heard keyboard sounds, mouse clicks, Derek muttering to himself. Then, according to the system, only your keycard has been used on room 7 today. You logged in at 8:03 this morning, and there's no record of the door opening since then. I went to lunch half an hour ago. The door was open when I came back. The system should have logged that. More keyboard sounds. Okay, that's strange. There's a 32-minute gap in the access log between 2:47 and 3:19 p.m. No entry or exit recorded, but the door was definitely opened. There's a power fluctuation registered right when the gap starts. What causes that? I don't know, maybe an electrical issue. I can call maintenance, have them check the reader. Yeah, do that. But in the meantime, can you tell me who else is in the building right now? Just me, you, and Margaret at reception. Why? Someone moved these boxes, arranged them in a specific pattern. It took time. Derek was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll come take a look." He arrived 3 minutes later, slightly out of breath from what must have been a jog down the corridor. He stopped in the doorway, staring at the box arrangement. "What the hell?" he said quietly. "You see it too?" "Yeah, that's definitely deliberate." He stepped into the room, walking the spiral pattern, examining the boxes as he went. "Do the numbers mean anything? 3, 7, 11. "Prime numbers," I said, "but I don't know why that would be significant." Derek pulled out his phone and took several photos, documenting the arrangement from different angles. Then he started checking the boxes themselves, looking at their labels, comparing them to some list on his phone. "These are all from the later years," he said. 1995 through 2021. The older boxes, the ones you've been working through, are still in their original positions." I hadn't noticed that, but he was right. The spiral consisted entirely of boxes from the final decades of Kemper's life, while the earlier material remained on the shelves where I'd found it. "Someone wants you to process these in a specific order," Derek said. "Who? You said no one else accessed the room." "According to the logs, yeah, but clearly someone was in here." He looked around, as if expecting to find a hidden door or a person lurking in corners that couldn't actually conceal anyone. "I'm going to review the security footage. We have cameras in the corridors. If someone came in here, we'll see them on tape." "Good, let me know what you find." "Will do. In the meantime," he gestured at the boxes, "do you want me to help you put these back?" I looked at the spiral pattern, the precise spacing, the mathematical progression. Someone had gone to considerable effort to create this arrangement. Disrupting it felt wrong somehow, like erasing a message before understanding what it said. "No," I said, "leave them. I'll work through them in whatever order makes sense for my cataloging." Derek nodded, though he looked uncertain. "Okay, but let me know if anything else weird happens, all right?" "Will do." He left, pulling the door firmly shut behind him. I heard the pneumatic seal engage, followed by the electronic beep of the lock mechanism. I stood there for a long time, staring at the boxes, trying to decide whether to follow the spiral pattern or deliberately ignore it. Finally, I compromised. I'd continue working through the boxes chronologically, but I'd make note of which ones had been moved and in what configuration. If there was a message embedded in the arrangement, maybe it would become apparent once I'd processed the contents. I pulled down the next box in chronological sequence, 1979-1982. It contained more financial records, showing continued expansion of Kemper Voss through the late 70s and early 80s. By 1981, they designed or consulted on 43 psychiatric facilities across 11 states. The revenue numbers had plateaued, still substantial, but no longer growing, suggesting market saturation. Several letters in the 1980 folder referenced maintenance concerns at facilities that had been operational for 5 or more years. Reading between the lines, it seemed like the buildings were deteriorating faster than expected. Water damage, structural settling, problems with electrical systems. Kemper had visited several sites personally, conducted inspections, submitted reports back to the facility administrators. One report, dated June 1980, caught my attention. The deviations observed at Millbrook are consistent with predictions. The geometry has continued to evolve, though the rate of change is slower than initially documented. Patient population remains stable at 127, unchanged for 17 months despite normal admission and discharge cycles. Recommend no intervention. The facility is performing as designed. There was that language again, performing as designed, as if the building were a machine and the patients were components whose stability indicated proper function. I photographed the report and moved on to the next folder. More letters, more financial records. Then, tucked between 2 folders near the back of the box, I found a photograph. It showed a building, a large institutional structure of brick and concrete, 3 stories tall with narrow windows and a flat roof. The architecture was distinctly 1970s, brutalist, unadorned, emphasizing function over aesthetics. A sign near the entrance read Millbrook Psychiatric Center. But the building looked wrong. Not damaged exactly, but distorted. The windows weren't quite aligned. They appeared to be at slightly different heights on each floor, creating a subtle diagonal pattern that shouldn't have been possible given standard construction techniques. And the brickwork was irregular, not in the way of craftsmanship variation, but as if the courses had shifted over time, settling into new configurations that violated the original geometry. I examined the photo more closely, using my phone's camera to zoom in on specific areas. The entrance doors were offset from the center of the building, positioned maybe 3 feet to the left of where they should be. And the roof line wasn't level. It sloped slightly from left to right, a tilt that would be imperceptible from ground level but obvious from this elevated, distant perspective. Someone had written on the back of the photo in pencil, "Millbrook, March 1980. Evolution continues." I set the photo aside and continued through the box. More financial records, nothing remarkable. But the photo stayed in my peripheral vision, that distorted building with its impossible geometry, and I found myself glancing at it every few minutes as if expecting it to have changed. By 5:30 p.m., I'd processed 3 more boxes and started feeling the cumulative fatigue of 2 long work days. My neck ached, my eyes burned, and I developed a persistent headache that ibuprofen wasn't touching. Time to call it a day. I packed up my equipment, organized the completed boxes, and checked my work one last time. 9 boxes processed in 2 days. Not bad, but not fast enough. At this rate, I'd need at least 7 more days to finish, which left me only 5 days of buffer before the deadline. I needed to pick up the pace. Derek was at reception when I signed out. "Any luck with the security footage?" I asked. "That's the weird thing," he said. "The cameras show the corridor outside your room during the time you were at lunch. No one went in or out. The door stayed closed the entire time. But it was open when I got back." "I know. I reviewed the footage twice. No one visible on camera, door stays shut, but according to the access log, there was that power fluctuation at 2:47, right when you left. It's like the system registered a door opening without anyone actually opening it." "Electrical malfunction." "Maybe. Maintenance is coming tomorrow to check the reader and the seal mechanism." He hesitated, then added, "Have you noticed anything else unusual? Sounds, movements, anything that seems off?" "The lights looked weird yesterday," I said. "Wrong color, but that was probably eye strain." "Probably," but he didn't sound convinced. "Just be careful, okay? This building is old, lots of quirks. Things don't always work like they're supposed to." I drove home through evening traffic, my mind replaying the day's discoveries. Kemper's journal entries, the photograph of the distorted building, the boxes arranged in a prime number spiral. None of it made sense individually, and together they formed a pattern I couldn't quite see but felt certain was there, just beyond my comprehension. That night I dreamed about Millbrook. I was walking through its corridors, past doors numbered in sequence, 101, 102, 103, but the numbers kept changing. I'd pass 103, then 104, but when I looked back, 103 had become 108, and 104 was now 97. The walls shifted as I moved, rearranging themselves according to rules I couldn't understand, but that felt mathematically precise, like watching an equation solve itself in physical space. I reached a door marked with a symbol instead of a number, 3 overlapping circles forming a pattern that hurt to look at. When I opened it, the room inside was impossibly large, extending beyond what the building's exterior dimensions could contain. And it was full of people, all sitting motionless in chairs arranged in concentric rings. They weren't restrained. They weren't sleeping. They were just waiting. Their eyes tracked me as I entered, but their heads didn't move. Their bodies remained perfectly still. I tried to speak, to ask what they were waiting for, but no sound came out. And then I realized I was sitting in one of the chairs too, had been sitting there the entire time, and the door I'd entered through was gone. The room had no exits, just rings of chairs, spiraling inward toward a center point I couldn't see because there were too many people in the way. I woke at 3:27 a.m., heart racing, sheets damp with sweat. The dream's logic dissolved immediately, but the feeling remained. That sense of being trapped in a space that followed rules I couldn't comprehend. I got up, drank water, checked my email to ground myself in something normal and mundane. There was a message from my contractor, sent at 11:43 p.m. Need to discuss the Kemper project. Call me in the morning. Nothing else. No context, no explanation for why it couldn't wait until business hours. I tried to go back to sleep but couldn't. My mind kept returning to Kemper's journal entries, that phrase about buildings that were self-sustaining. I got my laptop, opened my digital archive of scanned documents, and started searching through everything I'd processed so far. There were 17 references to Underhill scattered across the first 9 boxes. Most were financial, payments made, contracts signed, research expenditures, but 3 were substantive. I'd noted them in my index but hadn't connected them until now. First reference, a letter from Kemper to Dr. Voss, dated July 1972. The Underhill project represents our best opportunity to test theoretical models under controlled conditions. The state has given us complete design authority. Use it wisely. Second reference, a budget document from November 1973 showing a line item for Underhill specialized construction, totaling $847,000. Roughly $4 million in current dollars. The amount was substantially higher than any other single project in the records. Third reference, a memo from Voss to Kemper, March 1974. I've completed my final inspection of Underhill. The facility is operational, though I must again register my concerns about the basement levels. The geometry you've implemented exceeds any therapeutic justification. I'm documenting my objections formally and will include them in the project closeout report. The basement levels. I hadn't seen any blueprints showing basement construction. The plans I'd scanned were all single-story or multi-story above-ground structures. But clearly Underhill had underground components, and Voss had found them troubling enough to formally object. I searched for basement in my index documents. 6 hits, all from the later boxes I hadn't processed yet. The files were there, waiting, but inaccessible until I worked through them chronologically. Or I could skip ahead, pull one of those later boxes, find the basement blueprints, see what Voss had objected to. I looked at the clock, 4:18 a.m. Too early to go to the archive, too late to get meaningful sleep. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and tried to construct a timeline from memory. 1972. Kemper Voss begins the Underhill project 1973. Major construction expenditure 1974. Facility completed. Voss objects to basement design 1975. Company expands, adds new partners 1978. Kemper's mental state deteriorates. Journal entries become fragmented 1980. Millbrook facility shows evolution. Building geometry distorts. And then what? The boxes went all the way to 2021, almost 40 years of additional documentation. What had happened to Kemper Voss during those decades? The company must have continued operating. There were 50-plus boxes of records remaining, but in what capacity? At 7:45 a.m., I called my contractor. He answered immediately, as if he'd been waiting. "Vera, thanks for calling back. You said we needed to discuss the project." "Yeah, listen, I got a call yesterday from the Kemper family attorney. They're asking about your progress, want to know how much you've documented so far." "I'm on schedule. 9 boxes processed, 9 more this week. I'll hit the deadline easily." "That's good, but here's the thing. They specifically asked whether you'd found anything related to Underhill." I was quiet for a moment. Then, why would they care about a specific project? "I don't know, but when I told them you'd mentioned it in your texts, they got very interested. Wanted to know exactly what you'd found." "What did you tell them?" "That you were just cataloging, not analyzing content. But Vera, I need you to be careful here. If the family is asking specific questions about specific projects, there might be legal issues involved. Litigation, liability, I don't know. Just document everything, but don't draw conclusions, and definitely don't discuss your findings with anyone except me." "Understood. And if you find anything that seems legally problematic, evidence of fraud, malpractice, anything like that, you call me immediately. Don't just note it in your index." "Okay. How much more do you have to get through?" 54 boxes, maybe 8 more days of work." "Can you go faster?" "I can try, but the material is dense, and there's some weird stuff mixed in. Personal journals, photographs, things that need extra documentation time." "Do your best. The family is paying the rush fee for a reason." He paused. "And Vera, be careful. If someone is interested enough in this material to ask specific questions, that means there's something valuable or dangerous in there. Probably both." After we hung up, I sat with my coffee and thought about what dangerous might mean in this context. Corporate espionage, medical malpractice lawsuits, evidence of illegal activity. Or something else. Something that explained why boxes rearranged themselves. Why doors opened without anyone opening them. Why buildings distorted over time, their geometry evolving in ways that shouldn't be architecturally possible. I arrived at Silverwood Archive at 8:15. Derek looked like he hadn't slept well, dark circles under his eyes, coffee cup gripped tight enough to whiten his knuckles. "Morning," he said. "Maintenance is here. They're checking room 7 right now." "Did they find anything?" "Not yet. But they did confirm the power fluctuation yesterday. Something caused a brief electrical disruption in that section of the building. Not enough to trip breakers, but enough to reset the access log." "What could cause that?" "They're not sure. Faulty wiring maybe, or something drawing sudden power from the circuit." He set down his coffee cup, studied me. "You look tired." "Didn't sleep great." "Yeah, me neither. Had weird dreams about buildings actually. Construction architecture, not normally my thing." I thought about my own dream, those endless corridors, the impossible room with its spiraling chairs. What kind of buildings? Old ones, institutional like hospitals or schools from the 70s, and they kept changing. Rooms would be in different places when I looked again. Doors led to corridors that shouldn't exist. He laughed, embarrassed. "Told you it was weird." I had something similar. His smile faded. "Really?" Maybe we're both just stressed. Your electrical problems, my deadline pressure. Maybe, but he didn't sound convinced. The maintenance technician, a man in his 50s wearing a silverwood uniform and carrying a toolbox, emerged from the corridor. Access system's working fine now, he said. Reader, seal, electronic lock, all normal, but I found something odd. What? Derek asked. The power draw on that circuit. Room 7 is pulling almost 3 times more electricity than it should, given what's in there. Unless, he looked at me, you running some kind of heavy equipment, space heaters, servers, anything like that. Just a laptop and a document scanner, maybe 200 watts combined. Yeah, that's what I figured. But the circuit's showing a consistent 600-watt draw. Been that way for at least 3 days according to the meter history. Derek frowned. Where's the extra power going? No idea. There's nothing else on that circuit except the overhead lights, and those are LED, barely draw anything. I checked the outlets in the room. Nothing plugged in except your power strip. Tested the lights, working fine, normal draw. So either we've got a fault somewhere in the walls pulling phantom load, or he trailed off. Or what? I asked. Or the meter's wrong, but I tested it, it's accurate. Derek thanked him, promised to follow up if the problem persisted. After the technician left, Derek turned to me. You notice anything in the room that might explain this? Heat, unusual sounds, anything? No, it's a normal office environment. Maybe slightly cooler than I'd like, but nothing weird. Huh, he thought for a moment. Well, if you notice anything, lights flickering, outlets sparking, weird smells, get out immediately and call me. Will do. I headed to room 7, keycard ready. The reader blinked green. The pneumatic seal released with its familiar hiss. The door opened onto the same space I'd left yesterday. Boxes arranged in their spiral pattern, my work table clean and waiting, overhead lights casting their neutral glow. I stepped inside and immediately felt it. The temperature was wrong. Not cold exactly, but the air had a quality I couldn't name. It felt thicker somehow, like moving through a medium with greater resistance than normal atmosphere. And there was a smell faint, barely perceptible, like ozone after a lightning strike. Sharp and clean and fundamentally wrong for an enclosed room with no weather. I stood just inside the doorway for maybe 30 seconds, trying to decide whether to report this to Derek or write it off as anxiety and exhaustion making me hypersensitive to normal environmental variations. Finally, I compromised. I'd work for an hour, see if the sensations persisted or if they were just the artifact of suggestion and poor sleep. I pulled down box 10, dated 1982-1985, more financial records showing the company's revenue stabilizing around $3 million annually. Several letters documented the closure of 2 facilities, one in Ohio, another in Pennsylvania, due to structural complications that made them unsuitable for continued operation. No details about what those complications were. A folder labeled Site Surveys 1984 contained photographs of various facilities, all taken from similar distant, elevated perspectives. I recognized the style from the Millbrook photo I'd found yesterday. Each image showed a building with subtle distortions, windows slightly misaligned, walls meeting at angles that weren't quite right, roof lines that tilted in ways that should have been obvious to anyone looking but somehow weren't. And each photo had a note on the back, handwritten, documenting the evolution rate of the geometry. Millbrook, 3.7 degrees per year. Ashford, 2.1 degrees per year. Clearview, 5.4 degrees per year accelerating. Degrees of what? Angular deviation from original construction. But buildings didn't move like that. They settled, sure, foundations shifted, walls cracked, structures sagged over decades. But this was different. This was systematic, progressive change in the fundamental geometry of the buildings themselves. I photographed everything, making careful notes about each facility and its documented evolution rate. Then I found something that made me stop completely. A blueprint dated December 1984, labeled Standardized Baseline Design, All Facilities. It showed a floor plan that looked familiar, the same basic layout I'd seen in earlier blueprints, with patient rooms arranged around a central corridor. But this version had additional notations, annotations in Kemper's handwriting that covered every margin and blank space. The geometry must achieve stable equilibrium within 1824 months, one note read. Variations in evolution rate indicate localized distortions in baseline construction. Recommend remediation at sites exceeding 5 degrees year. Another note, near the bottom of the page, patient population functions as geometric stabilizer. Minimum threshold appears to be 100-120 individuals maintained at continuous occupancy. Below this threshold, evolution becomes unpredictable. And in the corner, almost too small to read, Underhill remains the only facility achieving true self-sustaining geometry. All others are approximations, derivatives of the original template. I sat back in my chair, trying to integrate this into any framework that made sense. Kemper was writing about buildings as if they were alive, as if they had behaviors and requirements, and he was describing patients, human beings, as components necessary for architectural stability. This wasn't business documentation. This was the record of someone experiencing severe mental illness, someone who had developed an elaborate delusional system around his professional work. Except the photographs were real. The buildings in those images actually existed, and they actually showed geometric distortions. Unless the photos were faked, doctored to support Kemper's delusions, but that seemed unlikely. This was the late 1970s and early 1980s, decades before digital manipulation made photo fakery easy. So either Kemper had somehow caused these distortions through faulty construction techniques, or what? Buildings don't evolve. Geometry doesn't change. Architecture is static. I forced myself to keep working, to maintain the cataloging process despite the growing sense that I was documenting something I didn't want to understand. Box 10 contained more of the same: financial records, site surveys, blueprints with increasingly disturbing annotations. By the time I finished, it was almost noon and my hands were shaking. I needed a break, fresh air, distance from this material. I left the room, made sure the door sealed properly, and walked to the break room. Empty again, just like yesterday. I grabbed my lunch from the refrigerator and sat at the table, trying to eat despite having no appetite. My phone buzzed. A text from Derek. Security footage from this morning shows something weird. Can you come to reception? I abandoned my lunch and headed back to the front desk. Derek had his laptop open. Video paused on a frame showing the corridor outside room 7. "Watch this," he said and pressed play. The video showed me approaching the door at 8:23 a.m. according to the timestamp. I swiped my key card. The reader blinked green. I opened the door and stepped inside. So far, normal. But then, for exactly 3 frames, 1/10 of a second, the image distorted. The corridor stretched, elongating impossibly, the door to room 7 receding into a distance that shouldn't exist in a hallway I knew was only 40 feet long. The walls bent inward, creating a forced perspective that made the space look miles deep. And in that stretched distance, I could see other doors, dozens of them, all numbered sequentially, extending beyond where the building's exterior walls should be. Then it snapped back to normal. Standard corridor, standard dimensions, me disappearing into room 7. What the hell was that? I asked. I don't know, some kind of video compression artifact, but I've never seen anything like it. Derek replayed the sequence, stepping through frame by frame. See, normal, 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 then this impossible perspective, then normal again. 3 frames at 30 frames per second. Has this happened before? Not that I've noticed, but I went back and checked yesterday's footage from when you reported the door being open. Same thing. Right at the moment of that power fluctuation, there's a 3-frame distortion in the video. He pulled up the previous day's footage, showed me the same phenomenon, corridor stretching, impossible depth, multiple doors that shouldn't exist. I'm going to submit a maintenance ticket for the security system, Derek said. This has to be a camera malfunction, maybe electromagnetic interference affecting the recording. Maybe, but I didn't believe it, and I could tell he didn't either. I returned to room 7, my lunch forgotten, and pulled down box 11. Dated 1985-1988, it contained more of what I'd come to expect. Financial records, site surveys, increasingly paranoid annotations on blueprints. But it also contained something new. A folder labeled Voss Correspondence Final. Inside, letters exchanged between Kemper and Voss during what appeared to be a deteriorating professional relationship. Voss was trying to convince Kemper to stop the experimental modifications to existing facilities. Kemper was refusing, insisting that the geometric evolution was proceeding exactly as intended. One letter from Voss, dated September 1986, was particularly direct. Harrison, I can no longer remain silent about what we've created. The facilities are not therapeutic environments. They are prisons, no, worse than prisons. They are systems designed to maintain human beings in states of permanent stasis. The patients don't recover. They don't deteriorate. They simply exist, unchanging, serving some function I never agreed to and still don't fully understand. I've reviewed the Underhill blueprints again. I've studied the modifications you implemented in the basement levels. I understand now what you were attempting, and I'm horrified that I participated in its construction. You need to stop this. We need to document what's happened and take responsibility for it. If we don't, if we let this continue, we're complicit in something that goes beyond medical malpractice into territory I don't have words for. Consider this my formal resignation from Kemper Voss. I'll be submitting a report to the State Licensing Board detailing my concerns. I hope you'll do the right thing and support that investigation rather than obstruct it. Kemper's response, dated 2 weeks later. Your resignation is accepted. Your report to the licensing board will be ignored, as will any further attempts you make to interfere with the project. You don't understand what we've accomplished because you lack the vision to see beyond conventional architecture. The facilities aren't prisons. They're solutions. The patients aren't imprisoned. They're integral. And Underhill isn't an aberration. It's a template. You're free to tell anyone you want about your concerns. No one will believe you, and if they did, they'd never find the evidence. The geometry consumes its own documentation. That's part of its beauty. Don't contact me again. I read both letters 3 times, trying to extract meaning from Kemper's increasingly incomprehensible statements. The geometry consumes its own documentation. What did that even mean? I photographed the letters, added them to my index with detailed keyword tags, and moved on to the next folder. More blueprints, these showing modifications to existing facilities. Kemper had been retrofitting buildings, adding basement levels to structures that hadn't originally included them. The construction costs must have been enormous, excavating under occupied buildings, reinforcing foundations, installing new mechanical systems. And every retrofit included the same features: unusually thick walls, no windows, restricted access, and annotations about geometric stability and evolution rate management. By 5:00 p.m., I'd processed 3 more boxes. My head throbbed. My vision had gone slightly blurry from screen glare, and I felt nauseated from spending too long in this sealed room breathing recycled air. I packed up my equipment, organized my materials, and prepared to leave. The boxes were still arranged in their spiral pattern. I'd been working around them all day, pulling boxes from the chronological sequence rather than following the deliberate arrangement someone had created. But now, looking at the pattern from the doorway, I noticed something I'd missed earlier. The spiral wasn't random. It was mathematical precise. And if I traced it from the outside inward, the boxes formed a sequence: 3, 7, 11, 17, 19, 23, 29, 31. Prime numbers, all prime numbers, arranged in ascending order. But there were gaps. Box 13 should have been in the sequence. 13 is prime, but it wasn't. Neither was box 37 or 41 or 43. The spiral contained only certain primes, selected according to criteria I couldn't identify. I pulled out my phone, photographed the arrangement from multiple angles, and made a note to research the sequence. Maybe the missing primes meant something. Maybe the pattern would reveal itself once I'd processed more boxes. Derek was at reception, looking even more exhausted than he had this morning. "Heading out?" he asked. "Yeah, long day. Did maintenance figure out the power draw issue?" "No, they're stumped. The circuit is definitely pulling 600 watts, but there's nothing in that room that should be consuming that much electricity." He paused. I checked the other archive rooms. Same thing. Every single one is pulling more power than it should. "All of them?" "All 7. Rooms 1 through 6 plus yours. Each one showing phantom loads of 500 to 700 watts with no apparent source." "That's concerning." "Yeah," he rubbed his eyes. "I'm thinking there's something in the walls. Old wiring, faulty insulation. Something that's creating resistance and converting electricity to heat. Would explain why we can't locate the draw. It's distributed throughout the circuits rather than concentrated at specific outlets." "Would that be dangerous?" "Potentially. If it's bad enough, it could start a fire. I've escalated to the building manager. They're bringing in an electrical contractor tomorrow to do a full inspection." I left him there, staring at his computer screen, clearly unhappy about the situation but unsure what else he could do. The drive home was a blur. I remember merging onto the highway, remember the familiar exit, remember parking in my apartment building's lot. but the specific details didn't register. My mind was occupied with primes and blueprints and buildings that evolved. I made dinner, something microwavable, probably pasta, and opened my laptop. I needed to research the prime number sequence, needed to understand why certain primes were included in the spiral while others were excluded. But first, I checked my email. Another message from my contractor, sent an hour ago. Kemper family attorney called again. They want to know specifically what you found related to Underhill. I told them you were still cataloging, but they're pressing hard. They've offered to double your completion bonus if you can prioritize Underhill-related materials and get them a summary by end of week. Let me know if you're interested. Double the bonus would be substantial, enough to cover 2 months' rent. But the request bothered me. Why were they so interested in one specific project? And why the urgency? I composed a careful response. I'll prioritize Underhill materials as I encounter them, but I need to maintain chronological processing to ensure complete documentation. Can probably have a summary by Friday. His reply came back almost immediately. That works. They're satisfied with that timeline. I closed my email and started researching the prime sequence. A quick search revealed that the primes in the spiral 3, 7, 11, 17, 19, 23, 29, 31 were all Sophie German primes. Primes where 2p plus 1 is also prime. For example, 3 is prime and 2, 3, plus 1 equals 7 is also prime. But why would someone arrange boxes according to Sophie German primes? What did that have to do with Kemper Voss, or Underhill, or architectural geometry? I spent 2 hours going down research rabbit holes, reading about prime number theory, geometric sequences, mathematical patterns in architecture. None of it explained what I was seeing. None of it made the boxes, the photos, the journal entries coherent. Finally, exhausted and frustrated, I closed my laptop and tried to sleep. The dream came immediately. I was in Underhill. I knew it was Underhill even though I'd never seen the building, had never found blueprints or photographs of it in the boxes I'd processed. But the knowledge was absolute. This was the template, the original facility that all others derived from. The architecture was wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Corridors met at angles that seemed normal until you tried to navigate them, at which point you realized the geometry didn't work, that turning right 3 times should bring you back to your starting point, but instead led somewhere entirely new. Rooms were larger inside than their exterior dimensions suggested. Ceilings tilted in directions that gravity shouldn't allow. And there were people, patients I assumed, though they wore no hospital gowns or identifying markers. They sat in chairs arranged in precise patterns, rows, columns, spirals, all facing directions that seemed random until I realized they were all looking at me, tracking my movement through the facility even though their heads never turned. Their bodies remained motionless. I tried to leave, to find an exit, but every corridor looped back onto itself. The building was consuming me, integrating me into its geometry. I could feel it happening, my thoughts slowing, my movements becoming mechanical, my awareness compressing into a single repeating pattern. And underneath everything, a sound. Not music, not voices, but a mathematical rhythm, prime numbers counted in sequence, each number held for a duration proportional to its value. 3 beats, 7 beats, 11 beats, 17, 19, 23. The sound was coming from the basement. I woke at 4:53 a.m., my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The dream's specificity lingered. I could still see those corridors, still feel the building's presence surrounding me like an environment with intention. I got up, drank water, checked my phone. No new messages. I opened my laptop and searched my document archive for any reference to Underhill's basement levels. 6 hits in the unprocessed boxes. The files were there, waiting in boxes I wouldn't reach for another 3 or 4 days if I maintained my chronological approach. Or I could skip ahead, pull box 47, where the first basement reference appeared, and see what Voss had objected to. I looked at the clock, 5:17 a.m. Too early to go to the archive, but I wouldn't be able to sleep again. I made coffee, showered, tried to eat breakfast, but couldn't. By 7:00 a.m., I was in my car, driving west through morning traffic. Derek wasn't at reception when I arrived. Neither was Margaret. The desk was empty, a small sign reading back at 8:00 a.m., propped against the computer monitor. I swiped my keycard at the corridor door. It blinked green. I walked past archive rooms 1 through 6, noting that all their doors were closed, no signs of occupancy. Room 7's door was also closed, the pneumatic seal intact. I swiped my card. The reader blinked green. The seal released with its characteristic hiss. And I smelled it immediately. That ozone scent, sharp and electric, now much stronger than yesterday. The air inside the room felt heavy, resistant, like pushing through water. The boxes had been rearranged again. Not just moved, reorganized completely. The spiral pattern was gone. Instead, the boxes had been stacked in a single column in the center of the room, balanced precariously, 54 boxes forming a tower that reached almost to the ceiling. The structure should have been unstable, should have collapsed under its own weight, but it stood perfectly vertical, each box precisely aligned with the ones above and below it. I stood in the doorway, trying to process what I was seeing. Someone had spent hours creating this, lifting each box, positioning it with absolute accuracy, building upward despite the physical impossibility of the later placements. You'd need scaffolding to reach the top boxes, need equipment to place them safely. Unless you didn't, unless the boxes had arranged themselves. I rejected that thought immediately. Boxes don't move on their own. Someone had done this, Derek, maybe, or the maintenance staff, or someone else with building access. There was a rational explanation. But the smell, that ozone smell that shouldn't exist in a sealed room, and the air, so heavy it felt like pressure against my skin. I pulled out my phone and called Derek. It went to voicemail. I called the main Silverwood number. It rang 8 times before going to an automated system. I was alone in the building. No, that wasn't right. Margaret had left a sign saying she'd be back at 8:00. Derek was probably just arriving, hadn't made it to his desk yet. The building wasn't empty. It just felt empty because I'd arrived unusually early. I stepped into the room, approached the tower of boxes. Up close, the construction was even more precise than it had appeared from the doorway. The edges aligned perfectly, no gaps, no variations. And the boxes weren't labeled in the order they'd been stacked. The bottom box was 47, one of the ones I'd specifically thought about during my sleepless early morning. The one containing the first reference to Underhill's basement. Above it, box 51, then 53, then 59. All prime numbers, all Sophie German primes. The tower was arranged in ascending prime order, starting from box 47 and continuing upward through the complete sequence. Someone knew what I was thinking. Someone had responded to my internal reasoning about which boxes to examine next. Or, and this was worse, the boxes themselves had responded. The arrangement had updated based on my intentions, my research, my dreams. I pulled box 47 from the tower. The structure didn't collapse. The remaining boxes settled slightly, compressing downward to fill the gap, maintaining perfect vertical alignment. I set box 47 on the work table, my hands shaking now, and opened it. Inside, blueprints, dozens of them, all labeled Underhill Psychiatric Center basement level construction. Dated 1973, they showed an underground structure far more extensive than the above-ground building. 3 subterranean floors, each larger than the one above it, expanding outward in a way that shouldn't be architecturally possible. The first basement level was roughly equal in area to the ground floor. The second was twice as large. The third was 4 times as large. The geometry was impossible. You couldn't excavate expanding volumes underground. Each level should be smaller than the one above it, constrained by foundation requirements and soil stability. But these plans showed the exact opposite, an inverted pyramid, widening as it descended. And the rooms, hundreds of them on each level, all identical in size and shape, all arranged in repeating patterns that created visual rhythms across the page. No corridors connecting them, no obvious means of access, just rooms stacked and arranged according to mathematical principles I couldn't identify but could feel, some organizational logic that bypassed conscious understanding and spoke directly to the part of my brain that recognized patterns. I photographed the first blueprint, forcing myself to maintain professional discipline, despite the growing certainty that I was documenting something I shouldn't see, something that had been deliberately hidden and now was revealing itself. The second blueprint showed mechanical systems, ventilation, plumbing, electrical, all standard infrastructure except for the specifications. The ventilation cycled air at rates far below code requirements, creating an environment where CO2 would accumulate, where oxygen levels would drop below what human consciousness required. And the electrical system included components I didn't recognize, equipment labeled with technical designations that meant nothing to me, but suggested specialized purpose. The third blueprint showed the lowest level, basement 3. It contained only one room, a single massive space occupying the entire floor, its dimensions annotated in Kemper's handwriting. 127 feet times 127 feet times 17 feet. A perfect rectangle, its proportions related by prime numbers. And in the center of that single room, a notation, primary geometric anchor, load-bearing structure not required, space maintains own stability. I photographed it, added it to my index, and moved to the next document in the box. A report dated April 1974, written by Voss. I have completed my inspection of Underhill's basement levels. I am submitting this report as formal documentation of my objections to the construction specifications implemented by Harrison Kemper, and as notice that I consider these specifications to represent a fundamental departure from the stated therapeutic purpose of this facility. The basement levels serve no medical function. They are not designed for patient care, staff accommodation, mechanical systems, or storage. Their purpose appears to be purely geometric, They exist to create a specific spatial relationship between the surface facility and some undefined point below it. The rooms on basement levels 1 and 2 are too small for human occupancy and lack appropriate egress. They are arranged in patterns that maximize spatial density while minimizing functional utility. I can identify no therapeutic, administrative, or safety-related justification for this design. Basement level 3 consists of a single large space with no apparent purpose. It is entirely empty, contains no equipment or infrastructure, and is accessible only through a single stairwell that violates multiple building codes related to emergency egress. Most concerning is the air quality in all basement levels. The ventilation system operates well below minimum standards, creating an environment that would be dangerous for prolonged human occupancy. I have measured CO2 levels exceeding 5,000 parts per million, levels that cause cognitive impairment and, with extended exposure, loss of consciousness. I cannot endorse this construction. I am recommending that the basement levels be sealed and never put into operational use. If Harrison insists on maintaining access to these spaces, I am formally requesting that my name be removed from all project documentation. I no longer understand what we are building. The report was unsigned, not in the sense that Voss had forgotten to sign it. The signature line was present, a space left for his name, but the space was empty, as if his signature had been removed, erased, made to disappear. I turned the page over, looking for any indication that this was a draft copy rather than the final version. Nothing, just blank paper where authentication should have been. I set the report aside and continued through box 47. More blueprints, more documentation of the basement construction, all of it confirming what Voss had described. An underground structure designed for purposes beyond my comprehension, built according to specifications that prioritized geometry over function. And then, near the bottom of the box, I found photographs. The first showed basement level 1 during construction. The rooms were partially framed, bare studs marking their boundaries, concrete floors poured but not finished. Workers were visible in the image, maybe 6 or 7 people, all wearing hard hats and work clothes. They were standing motionless, facing the camera, their postures identical. The second photo showed the same level after completion. Finished walls, painted surfaces, industrial lighting installed overhead, but no doors on the rooms. The framing suggested doors had been planned. I could see hinges mounted to jambs, but the actual door panels were absent. Just open rectangles leading into small, identical spaces. The third photo showed basement level 3, that single massive room. It was empty except for what appeared to be floor markings. The floor was covered in lines, precisely drawn or perhaps painted, creating a pattern that reminded me of circuit diagrams or mandala designs. Concentric shapes, circles, squares, triangles, nested inside each other, connected by straight lines that intersected at angles I couldn't calculate but that felt mathematically significant. And at the very center, a spiral pattern made of dots, each dot positioned according to some sequence I couldn't identify from the photograph alone, but suspected was related to primes. Someone had written on the back of this photo, completed May 1974, activation pending. Activation, as if the room were a machine rather than a space, as if geometry could be turned on. I photographed everything, my hands now shaking badly enough that I had to brace my phone against the table to keep the images stable. I wanted to stop, to close this box and return it to the tower, to leave this building and never come back. But I couldn't. The material had a gravity, a pull that kept me processing, documenting, moving forward through revelations I didn't want but couldn't refuse. Box 47 contained one more document, a single page, typed on what looked like the same typewriter Kemper had used for earlier correspondence. No date, no signature, just text. The Underhill geometry is stable. Patient population reached threshold occupancy, 119 individuals, on October 3, 1974. Basement level 3 achieved resonance on October 7, 1974 at 3:47 a.m. The building is now self-sustaining. All subsequent facilities will be derivatives of this template. The geometry will propagate naturally once baseline specifications are implemented. Evolution rates will vary based on local conditions, but eventual stabilization is inevitable. The patients are necessary but not aware. They serve as anchors, their presence maintaining the spatial relationships required for geometric coherence. They will not leave. They cannot leave. The building holds them through their own consent, through the simple fact of their continued existence within its boundaries. This is not imprisonment, this is integration. They are part of the structure now, as essential as walls and floors, and they are content. The geometry provides for them. It meets their needs, food, shelter, basic care, without requiring their active participation. They sit, they wait, they maintain the pattern through the simple fact of being. I understand now that Underhill was never meant to treat mental illness. It was meant to study a different kind of pattern, the pattern of human awareness when stripped of purpose, reduced to pure presence, integrated into mathematical space. The results are promising. The patients show no signs of distress, no attempts to leave, no deterioration in physical health. They have reached equilibrium. They exist in a state we might call stable consciousness, aware but not active, present but not purposeful. And the building grows, not physically. The walls remain where we placed them, but spatially. The interior expands, creates new volumes that shouldn't exist within the original footprint. The basement levels are larger now than they were when we completed construction. The rooms multiply, the corridors extend. The geometry elaborates itself according to rules I glimpse but cannot fully articulate. This is what architecture can be when freed from the constraint of serving human purpose. This is building that exists for its own sake, that perpetuates itself through the manipulation of space and the integration of occupants who have no other function than to be present. I am pleased with what we have created. I am terrified by what it will become. I read the document 3 times, my comprehension fragmenting with each pass. The language was clear enough. Kemper was describing Underhill as if it were alive, as if the building had achieved some kind of independence from its original purpose. But the concepts underneath the language were incomprehensible. Buildings don't grow. They don't think. They don't integrate occupants into their structural logic. Unless they do. Unless everything I understood about architecture and space was incomplete, missing some essential truth that Kemper had discovered and implemented in his designs. I closed box 47, returned it to the tower. The remaining boxes settled again, compressing upward, maintaining their vertical alignment through mechanisms I couldn't see and didn't want to imagine. I pulled box 51, the next in the prime sequence. This one contained financial records from 1989-1992, showing Kemper Voss's gradual decline. Revenue dropping, contracts becoming scarce, facilities closing due to structural unsuitability. Several letters from state health departments revoking operating licenses, citing violations that were never specified in detail. Just vague language about environmental concerns and patient safety issues. One letter from the Pennsylvania Department of Health was more specific. Following our inspection of the Clearview Psychiatric Center on August 14, 1991, we are revoking the facility's operating license effective immediately. Our inspectors have documented the following violations. 1. The building's interior layout does not match approved blueprints. Rooms, corridors, and common areas have been relocated or modified without proper permits or structural engineering approval. 2. Patient capacity consistently exceeds licensed limits. Our census count identified 187 individuals residing in a facility licensed for 120. 3 patients cannot accurately describe their location within the building or identify primary egress routes. When asked to navigate from their rooms to the main entrance, 100% of interviewed patients became disoriented and required staff assistance. 4. The ventilation system operates below code-required standards, creating air quality conditions unsuitable for long-term occupancy. 5. Electrical power consumption far exceeds expected usage for a facility of this size, with no identified source for the excess draw. All patients must be transferred to alternative facilities within 30 days. The building must be vacated and secured pending further investigation. We strongly recommend that Kemper Voss cease operations at all facilities designed using similar specifications. We will be sharing this report with health departments in other states where your firm has active projects. So it wasn't just Underhill. The geometry had propagated exactly as Kemper had predicted. All the derivative facilities were exhibiting the same impossible characteristics: expanding interiors, excessive power consumption, patient populations that couldn't navigate their own environment. But the letter mentioned patient transfers. If Clearview had been evacuated, what had happened to the 187 people living there? Where had they gone? I searched through the rest of Box 51, looking for any follow-up documentation. I found a single memo, dated September 1991, from Kemper to someone named Dr. Helena Sayers. Clearview patients successfully relocated per your recommendations. Integration into receiving facilities proceeding normally. No adverse reactions reported. The geometry maintains them even when physically separated from original structure. This confirms the hypothesis that the pattern exists independently of specific buildings once properly established. Recommend similar relocations for Ashford and Millbrook given increasing regulatory scrutiny. The buildings themselves are expendable. The patients are what matter. They carry the pattern with them. The patients carry the pattern with them. I set down the memo, my mind trying and failing to construct a framework where that sentence made sense. Kemper was describing people as if they were infectious, as if they'd been changed by their time in these buildings, and now carried that change wherever they went. I thought about the dream I'd had, those motionless figures in their concentric chairs, all tracking my movement with eyes that never blinked. I thought about Kemper's description of stable consciousness, awareness without purpose, presence without agency. And I thought about my own behavior over the past 3 days. The missing time, the fugue state where I'd processed an entire box without remembering it, the dreams that felt more like memories, showing me buildings I'd never seen with architectural precision I shouldn't possess. I stood up from the table too quickly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. I needed to leave, needed to get out of this room, this building, needed to put distance between myself and this material before. Before what? Before I became part of the pattern. Before the geometry integrated me the way it had integrated Kemper's patience, reducing me to stable consciousness, pure presence, another anchor maintaining spatial relationships I couldn't perceive but was already serving. I grabbed my laptop, my scanner, my phone. I left the boxes where they were, the tower standing impossibly in the center of the room, Box 51 open on the table with its disturbing revelations exposed to empty air. I got to the door and swiped my keycard. The reader blinked red. I swiped again, red. Again, red. The door was locked, not malfunctioning. The reader was responding, acknowledging my keycard but refusing to grant access. I was sealed in. I pressed my full weight against the door, trying to force it open through mechanical failure if not electronic authorization. The pneumatic seal held. The door didn't move. I pulled out my phone to call Derek. No signal. I had full bars when I arrived, but now the screen showed no service, as if the building had suddenly begun blocking cellular transmission. I tried the Wi-Fi. Connected, strong signal, but no internet access. The network was present but empty, a closed loop leading nowhere. I was trapped in a room with impossible boxes and documentation describing buildings that consumed their occupants. And no one knew I was here because I'd arrived early, before the building officially opened, before staff had reached their desks. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to think rationally. The door's electronic lock had failed or been triggered by some security protocol I didn't understand. But it was just electronics. There would be a manual override, a fail-safe mechanism that allowed egress in case of emergency. I examined the door carefully. Standard commercial construction, metal frame, heavy-gauge steel door panel. The lock mechanism was embedded in the frame, accessible only from the outside. No visible override switch or release handle on the interior. But there had to be something. Building codes required emergency egress from all occupied spaces. You couldn't create a room that locked people inside without providing an escape method. Unless Kemper had designed these rooms the same way he designed his psychiatric facilities, spaces meant to hold occupants regardless of their desire to leave, geometry that integrated people through their own continued presence. No, that was paranoid thinking, the kind of logic that led to panic and poor decision-making. I was in an archive facility designed for document storage, not a psychiatric center built according to impossible specifications. The door was malfunctioning. Someone would come check on me eventually. Derek would arrive, notice my car in the parking lot, check the access logs, and see I was in room 7. I just had to wait. I sat at the table, trying to calm my racing heart, trying not to look at the tower of boxes that had arranged themselves according to my thoughts. Minutes passed. Maybe 10, maybe 20 time felt distorted, unreliable. The overhead lights maintained their fluorescent constancy, 60-cycle hum unchanged. The air remained heavy, resistant, That ozone smell now so familiar I barely noticed it. And then I heard it. A sound from above, from the ceiling, or perhaps from beyond it, from a space that shouldn't exist above this single-story building, but that I could somehow perceive, some volume that extended upward into impossible dimensions. Footsteps, multiple sets moving in rhythm synchronized, not walking randomly but following a pattern, 3 steps, pause, 7 steps, pause, 11 steps, pause. Prime numbers counted in footfalls. The sound continued for maybe 2 minutes, following the sequence I'd memorized from my research. 3, 7, 11, 17, 19, 23, 29, 31. Then it stopped. Silence. Then a different sound. Closer, more immediate. Something moving in the walls, or perhaps the walls themselves moving, structure shifting, geometry adjusting. I stood up from the table, pressed my ear against the wall. I could feel it. Subtle vibration, rhythmic pulsing, as if the building had a heartbeat. And underneath that, a sound like water flowing or air moving through constricted spaces, or something I had no reference for, some acoustic phenomenon produced by architecture that existed in dimensions I couldn't visualize. The tower of boxes trembled. I stepped back, watching as the structure swayed slightly, boxes shifting minutely against each other. But it didn't collapse. Instead, it seemed to pulse in rhythm with the wall vibrations, the entire system synchronized, building and boxes moving together in response to some stimulus I couldn't identify. And then the boxes began to rearrange themselves. I watched it happen. No invisible hands, no concealed mechanisms. Just boxes sliding against each other, rotating, changing positions within the tower. The movement was slow, deliberate, each box following a path that minimized disturbance to the overall structure. They flowed like water, or like some viscous fluid with unusual properties, maintaining cohesion while reconfiguring their relationships. The tower transformed into a spiral, boxes arranging themselves in a pattern that descended from ceiling height to floor level, creating a continuous curve that drew my eye around and around, forcing my visual attention to follow the sequence, to trace the path from beginning to end. And at the center of the spiral, a gap, a space where one box should be but wasn't, an absence that felt deliberate, meaningful. Box 59, the next prime in the sequence, the box I should examine next if I wanted to continue following the pattern. I didn't want to. I wanted the door to open, wanted Derek to appear and tell me this was all some elaborate practical joke, wanted to leave and never return. But I couldn't leave. The door remained locked, and the boxes had created a message I understood perfectly. Continue processing, continue documenting, continue following the pattern toward whatever revelation waited at its conclusion. I approached the spiral, reached for box 59 where it sat 3/4 of the way through the curve. The moment my hand touched it, the door's electronic lock beeped. I turned. The keycard reader was blinking green. I could leave. I could abandon this project, forfeit the payment, report the entire situation to whom? Who would believe me? Derek had seen the security footage distortions, but those could be dismissed as camera malfunctions. The boxes rearranging themselves. No evidence except my testimony, and I was already questioning my own reliability. And there was the other problem. I wanted to know. Despite everything, the impossible geometry, the trapped patience, the buildings that grew beyond their boundaries, I wanted to understand what Kemper had discovered. The pattern was real. The mathematics were consistent. There was something here, some truth about space and structure and human consciousness that existed beyond conventional understanding. I was already integrated. I'd been processing this material for 3 days, spending hours immersed in Kemper's documentation, dreaming about his buildings, thinking in his patterns. The geometry had me, not as completely as it had held his patience. I could still make choices, still felt the desire to leave, but I was connected now, part of the system. And if I left without understanding, without completing the documentation, the pattern would remain incomplete. I would carry it with me, unresolved, a fragment of geometric truth lodged in my consciousness without context or conclusion. I made a decision that felt inevitable, as if I'd been moving toward this moment since I first opened Box 1. I would continue. I would process the remaining material, document everything, follow the pattern to its end. And then, with complete information, I would decide what to do with what I'd learned. I pulled Box 59 from the spiral. The remaining boxes didn't collapse or rearrange. They simply held their positions, the spiral pattern intact except for the deliberate absence where Box 59 had been. Inside, correspondence from 1995-1998, showing the final years of Kempervoss as a functioning company. Most of the facilities had been closed by now, their licenses revoked, their patients relocated. Only Underhill remained operational, grandfathered under old regulations that no longer applied to new construction. And Kemper had changed. His writing style in these later documents was different, more coherent than his fragmented journal entries, but also more distant, as if he were describing events happening to someone else rather than documenting his own experiences. A letter to an unnamed recipient, dated January 1997. You asked whether I regret creating the geometry. The answer is complex. I regret the suffering caused during the initial implementations, when we didn't yet understand the integration process. Those early patients experienced distress, confusion, resistance to the pattern. We could have been more careful, more gradual in our approach. But I don't regret the discovery itself. The geometry exists whether I acknowledge it or not. I simply found a way to make it visible, to create structures that embody mathematical relationships most people perceive only abstractly. Think of music. Sound waves are mathematical, frequencies, harmonics, rhythmic patterns. But when properly structured, they create emotional experiences that transcend the underlying mathematics. People don't think about sine waves when they hear a symphony. They feel something ineffable, something that exists only because the mathematical relationships have been made physical through vibration. Architecture is the same. Space has mathematical properties, dimensions, proportions, geometric relationships. Most buildings ignore these properties or implement them unconsciously. But when you deliberately structure space according to precise mathematical principles, you create experiential effects that transcend normal architectural function. The patients in Underhill aren't prisoners. They're participants in a geometric system that provides them with a form of stability they couldn't achieve in normal environments. Their mental illnesses, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, these are expressions of consciousness unable to find coherent patterns in everyday experience. The geometry gives them pattern. It provides a framework their minds can rest against, a structure that holds them without requiring them to maintain themselves through their own effort. Is this therapeutic? By conventional measures, no, they don't recover. They don't return to society. They remain in Underhill indefinitely, their conditions unchanged but also untroubling. But is it humane? I believe so. They aren't suffering. They've reached a state of equilibrium that, while unusual by external standards, represents a valid form of human existence. They sit, they eat, they sleep. They occupy space in a way that serves the geometric pattern while the pattern serves them by providing environmental stability. I understand that this makes me complicit in something most people would consider unethical. I've created buildings that integrate human beings into structural systems, that reduce consciousness to pure presence. I've designed spaces that hold people not through physical barriers, but through mathematical relationships they can't perceive but can't escape. And yet the buildings work. The geometry functions exactly as intended, and the people within them have found a form of peace that psychiatric medication and therapy could never provide. So no, I don't regret the discovery. I regret only that I cannot make others understand what I've created. The pattern is self-evident to me now. I see it everywhere, in naturally occurring geometric relationships, in the unconscious rhythms of human behavior, in the mathematical structures underlying consciousness itself. But to most people, it remains invisible. They walk through Underhill and see only corridors and rooms, patients and staff. They don't perceive the spatial relationships creating the experiential effects. They don't understand that the building is a machine for generating stable consciousness, that every dimension and proportion has been calibrated to produce specific psychological states in its occupants. Perhaps that invisibility is necessary. Perhaps the geometry functions precisely because it operates below conscious awareness, shaping experience without revealing its mechanisms. Making it visible might break it, might force people to resist what they would otherwise accept naturally. I find myself wondering whether I, too, have been integrated, whether my understanding of the pattern represents genuine insight, or whether I've simply been shaped by prolonged exposure to geometric systems of my own design. Am I discovering mathematical truths about architecture? Or am I experiencing elaborate delusions generated by buildings that have colonized my thinking? I don't know, and increasingly I find the distinction unimportant. The geometry works, the buildings function, the patients stabilize. Whether this represents objective truth or consensual delusion, the effects are real. That will have to be enough. The letter was signed, but the signature was illegible. Not Kemper's precise architectural handwriting, but a scrawled mark that could have been initials or could have been meaningless gesture. I photographed the letter, added it to my index, and continued through box 59. More financial records showing Kemper-Voss's dissolution, final contracts, dissolution paperwork filed with various state agencies. The company officially ceased operations in December 1999. All remaining assets transferred to something called the Underhill Foundation. A brief document described the foundation's purpose: to maintain and operate the Underhill Psychiatric Center in perpetuity, ensuring continuous care for its resident population and preservation of its unique architectural properties. So Underhill was still operational. 25 years after Kemper's letter, the facility still existed, still held its integrated patients, still maintained its impossible geometry. I checked my phone, 10:47 a.m. I'd been in this room for 3 hours. The door remained unlocked. The keycard reader still showed green, but I hadn't attempted to leave. I'd been pulled into the pattern, processing box after box, following the sequence towards some conclusion I could feel approaching but couldn't yet visualize. I returned box 59 to the spiral and pulled the next one, box 61. The prime numbers continued, each box revealing more of Kemper's final years. This box contained personal correspondence from 2000-2004, letters between Kemper and various individuals, former colleagues, family members, people inquiring about his work. Many went unanswered. The few responses Kemper sent were brief, almost cryptic, suggesting someone who had withdrawn from normal social interaction. One exchange stood out, a letter from someone named Marcus Hollies, dated March 2003. Professor Kemper, I'm a doctoral student in architecture at MIT, conducting research on institutional design in the 1970s. Your work with psychiatric facilities during that period is frequently cited in historical literature, but I haven't been able to locate detailed documentation of your design principles. Would you be willing to be interviewed for my dissertation? I'm particularly interested in your approach to spatial planning and your innovative use of geometric proportions in therapeutic environments. I'd be grateful for any time you could spare. Best regards, Marcus Hollies. Kemper's response, dated 2 weeks later. Mr. Hollies, I appreciate your interest, but I must decline your interview request. My work cannot be adequately explained through conventional architectural discourse. The principles I employed were not innovations, but discoveries, mathematical relationships that exist independently of human design intent. If you wish to understand what I created, you must experience it directly. I can arrange a visit to Underhill, where the geometry remains intact and fully operational. You would need to stay for a minimum of 72 hours to perceive the spatial effects clearly. However, I must warn you, direct exposure to the pattern carries risks. Some visitors find the experience disturbing. Others find it transformative. A few have requested to remain permanently, which we accommodate when appropriate. Let me know if you're interested in this approach. Otherwise, I cannot assist with your research. H. Kemper. There was no record of Hollies' response, no indication whether he'd accepted the invitation. I searched my phone for Marcus Hollies' MIT architecture. Several results appeared, all from 2003-2004. News articles, university press releases, and then, from June 2004, a missing person report. MIT doctoral student Marcus Hollies, 28, has been missing since April 15. Hollies was last seen leaving his apartment in Cambridge to conduct research interviews for his dissertation. Family members say he planned to visit a psychiatric facility in rural Pennsylvania, but did not specify which one. Anyone with information should contact Cambridge police. And then, from August 2004, a final update. Missing MIT student Marcus Hollies has been located at the Underhill Psychiatric Center in Pennsylvania, where he had been staying as part of his research. Hollies declined to return to Massachusetts, informing his family that he had decided to remain at the facility. While police found no evidence of coercion or unlawful detention, Hollies' family has expressed concerns about his mental state. The investigation is closed. He'd been integrated. Kemper had invited him to experience the geometry directly, and now Hollies lived in Underhill, another anchor maintaining the spatial pattern, another consciousness reduced to stable presence. I felt sick. Not physically ill, but a deeper nausea, an existential revulsion at what I was reading. Kemper wasn't just describing a philosophical concept. He was actively recruiting people, exposing them to environments that permanently altered their consciousness, adding them to his collection of human anchors. And I was here, in a building owned by the same organization, processing documentation that described these methods in detail. What was Silverwood Archive? Who operated it? Was this entire facility designed according to Kemper's principles, using his geometric specifications? I thought about the phantom power draws, the identical anomalies in all 7 archive rooms. I thought about the corridor distortions in the security footage, those 3 frames showing impossible depth. I thought about the boxes rearranging themselves, responding to my thoughts, organizing themselves according to mathematical patterns I'd researched. Silverwood wasn't just storing Kemper's documentation. It was implementing his geometry. I stood up from the table, moving too fast again, chair scraping against floor. I needed to leave. Now. Immediately. Before I spent enough time in this space to become permanently integrated like Hollies, like the Underhill patients, like everyone who had encountered Kemper's pattern and couldn't resist its pull. I grabbed my equipment, stuffed it haphazardly into my laptop bag. I didn't care about the documentation anymore, didn't care about the completion bonus or the deadline. I just needed to get out of this building, put distance between myself and this material, break the pattern before it finished establishing itself in my consciousness. I ran to the door, swiped my keycard. Red. The lock had reset. I was sealed in again. I pounded on the door, shouting for Derek, for Margaret, for anyone who might hear me. My voice disappeared into the heavy air, absorbed by some acoustic property of the space that shouldn't exist in a standard office room. I tried calling Derek again, still no signal. I tried the emergency number, no signal. I tried everything, restarting my phone, toggling airplane mode, forcing it to search for networks manually. Nothing worked. The room had me. The geometry had integrated my presence, and now it wouldn't release me until some condition was satisfied. I knew what that condition was. The boxes remained arranged in their spiral, the pattern incomplete, gaps marking primes I hadn't yet processed. The system wanted me to continue documentation, to follow the sequence through to its conclusion. And if I refused, would I remain locked in this room indefinitely, held by mathematical relationships I couldn't perceive but couldn't escape? Would I eventually accept my integration, stop trying to leave, settle into stable consciousness like Kemper's patients? Or would the building eventually release me, satisfied that I'd seen enough, absorbed enough of the pattern to carry it forward even if I never returned? I couldn't know, but I understood that resistance was pointless. The door would remain locked until I either processed the remaining boxes or until my consciousness stabilized enough that leaving no longer mattered. I made a choice. Not the choice I wanted to make, but the only choice available. I would complete the documentation. I would process every box, follow every prime number, absorb the entire pattern. And then, with comprehensive understanding, I would find a way to break free of the geometry's hold and ensure no one else fell into this trap. It was rationalization, probably. A way of justifying continued participation in something I should have fled from immediately. But it felt like agency, like conscious decision-making rather than helpless integration. I returned to the table, sat down, pulled the next box from the spiral. Box 67. Inside, documentation from 2005-2008, showing Underhill's continued operation under the Foundation's management. Financial records indicated stable funding. Apparently, the facility received grants from various sources, private donors and institutional supporters who valued its innovative approach to long-term psychiatric care. One report, dated November 2006, provided census data: 143 patients, unchanged for 32 consecutive months. No admissions, no discharges, no deaths. Just stable occupancy, the same 143 individuals maintaining the geometric pattern through their continuous presence. But that didn't make sense. People age, develop medical conditions, die from natural causes. How could a population of 143 remain perfectly static for nearly 3 years? Unless the geometry did more than stabilize consciousness. Unless it also stabilized physical processes, holding bodies in equilibrium the same way it held minds. I found a medical report, signed by someone named Dr. Wei Chen, dated March 2007. Annual health screenings of Underhill's patient population reveal continuing trends observed over the past decade. 1. No significant changes in biometric measurements, height, weight, blood pressure, etc., across patient cohort despite normal aging expectations. 2. Absence of age-related conditions typically observed in populations with average age of 57. No cardiac disease, no cancer diagnoses, no degenerative neurological conditions. 3. Healing rates for minor injuries, cuts, bruises, strains proceed at rates consistent with individuals 20-30 years younger than chronological age. 4. Nutritional requirements approximately 30% lower than standard dietary guidelines, suggesting reduced metabolic demands. 5. Sleep patterns highly regular. All patients maintain 8-hour sleep cycles with minimal individual variation, synchronizing to within 15-minute windows regardless of personal sleep preferences documented prior to admission. I can offer no medical explanation for these findings. The patient population appears to be aging at significantly reduced rates while maintaining physical health far exceeding statistical norms for their demographics. The only consistent factor across all patients is their continuous residence within Underhill's geometric environment. I can only conclude that some property of the facility's spatial configuration is producing these biological effects, though the mechanism remains unclear. I recommend continued monitoring, but no intervention unless specific health concerns emerge. The geometry was keeping them alive, not just conscious, not just stable, but physically preserved, aging slowed or stopped entirely, bodies maintained through the same mathematical relationships that held their minds. Kemper had created immortality machines, buildings that could hold human beings in permanent stasis, consciousness and biology, both frozen in geometric equilibrium. I thought about what he'd written in that 1997 letter. The patients aren't suffering. Maybe that was true. Maybe they'd found a form of existence beyond conventional human concerns. No pain, no illness, no death, just endless presence maintained by architectural mathematics. But they'd also lost something essential: agency, purpose, the capacity for change. They existed without living, present without participating, conscious without experiencing anything beyond the geometric pattern that held them. And people like Marcus Hollis had voluntarily joined them, choosing stable consciousness over the uncertainty and struggle of normal existence. I processed box after box, the hours blurring together. Box 71 contained documentation from 2009-2012. Box 73, 2013-2015. Box 79, 2016-2018. Each one showing Underhill's continued operation, its patient population never changing, its geometry functioning exactly as Kemper had designed it decades earlier. And then Box 83, dated 2019-2021, the most recent material in the collection. This box was different. Instead of routine operational records, it contained correspondence between the Underhill Foundation and various parties interested in replicating the facility's approach. Architectural firms requesting Kemper's specifications, mental health organizations asking about patient outcomes, research institutions proposing studies. The Foundation declined all requests. Kemper's designs would remain proprietary. Underhill would remain unique. The pattern would not propagate further. But there was one exception. A letter dated August 2020 from the Underhill Foundation to someone named Robert Silverwood. Mr. Silverwood, we appreciate your interest in preserving Harrison Kemper's professional legacy. As you noted in your proposal, the complete documentation of his architectural career exists in fragmentary form across multiple private collections. Your offer to consolidate these materials in a dedicated archive facility would certainly serve historical scholarship. However, we have specific requirements for how Kemper's documentation should be stored and accessed. 1. The archive facility must be constructed according to specifications we will provide. These specifications are non-negotiable and reflect Kemper's own principles regarding optimal environmental conditions for document preservation. 2. Access to the materials must be carefully controlled. Researchers should process the documentation in dedicated rooms designed for extended study periods. We've found that proper understanding of Kemper's work requires sustained engagement with the materials. 3. The facility should be located in a relatively isolated area, minimizing casual traffic and ensuring researchers can work without external distractions. If you can accept these requirements, we're prepared to transfer Kemper's complete professional archive to your organization. We'll also provide operational funding for the facility's first 5 years, along with technical consultation during construction and initial operations. Please confirm your interest, and we'll begin the planning process. Dr. Helena Sayers, Director, Underhill Foundation. I read the letter 3 times, each pass confirming what I already knew. Silverwood Archive had been designed by the Underhill Foundation. The building I was sitting in had been constructed according to Kemper's geometric specifications. The archive rooms, all 7 of them, were derivative implementations of the same pattern that held patients in Underhill. And I'd been working in one of those rooms for 3 days, processing documentation specifically selected to expose me to Kemper's ideas, spending hours immersed in material designed to integrate my consciousness into the geometric pattern. I was being recruited, not overtly, not through direct invitation like Marcus Hollis had received, but through a more subtle process. Gradual exposure, increasing engagement, voluntary participation in a system whose true nature only revealed itself after integration was already underway. Derek probably didn't know. He was just facility staff, hired to manage day-to-day operations, unaware that the building he worked in was an architectural trap designed to capture the consciousness of anyone who spent sufficient time in its rooms. Or maybe he did know. Maybe he was already integrated, his friendly demeanor and corporate professionalism just a performance, a role he played to maintain normal operations while the building's geometry did its real work. I stood up from the table, looked at the remaining boxes in their spiral arrangement. 3 more to process: Box 89, Box 97, Box 101. 3 more primes in the sequence. The final boxes, the conclusion of the pattern. I didn't want to open them. I knew what I would find: more documentation of Kemper's project, more evidence of the Underhill Foundation's efforts to perpetuate his geometric systems, more proof that I was trapped in an environment specifically designed to integrate me. But I also needed to know. The pattern was incomplete. 3 gaps remained, and some part of me, the part that had been processing these materials for 3 days, the part that had started to think in geometric terms, the part that understood the mathematical elegance of Kemper's approach even while recoiling from its implications, that part needed to reach the end of the sequence. I pulled Box 89. Inside, a single document. Not correspondence, not financial records, not blueprints. Just a typed page, unsigned, undated. If you're reading this, you've processed sufficient material to understand the basic principles of geometric consciousness integration. You've seen the evidence, absorbed the pattern, begun to think in terms of spatial mathematics rather than conventional architectural function. You're probably frightened. That's natural. The pattern challenges fundamental assumptions about consciousness, agency, and human existence. It suggests that what we call self is just an emergent property of geometric relationships. That awareness is something that can be shaped through architectural manipulation. But fear is counterproductive. The geometry isn't hostile. It doesn't harm you. It simply provides a framework, a stable environmental structure that your consciousness can rest against without requiring constant self-maintenance. Think about how exhausting normal existence is. You must continually make decisions, maintain relationships, pursue goals, manage emotions, create meaning. Consciousness without external support demands endless effort. Most people spend their entire lives struggling to maintain coherent patterns of thought and behavior in environments that provide no assistance. The geometry offers an alternative. It creates space that actively supports consciousness, that provides the structural framework most people desperately need but never find. The patients in Underhill aren't imprisoned. They're relieved. They've found an environment that holds them without requiring them to hold themselves. You can leave, of course. The door will open eventually, but you'll carry the pattern with you. You've absorbed enough of it now that it will continue operating in your consciousness regardless of physical location. You'll find yourself thinking geometrically, perceiving spatial relationships you couldn't see before, feeling the absence of architectural support in normal environments. And you'll be drawn back, not through compulsion, but through recognition that the geometry provides something you need, something you didn't know you were missing until you experienced it directly. The choice is yours, but understand that it's a choice you've already made, dozens of times over the past 3 days, Every time you opened another box, processed another document, followed the pattern deeper into its implications. Welcome to geometric consciousness. Welcome to the pattern that holds without confining, that supports without demanding, that exists whether you acknowledge it or not. Welcome home. I read it twice, my hands completely steady now, the shaking that had plagued me earlier mysteriously gone. The fear I'd felt, that visceral terror of being trapped, of losing myself to something incomprehensible, had faded to a distant concern, like worrying about a problem that belonged to someone else. And I recognized what was happening. The integration process was completing. My consciousness was settling into the geometric framework, accepting the pattern as natural rather than threatening. The building had been working on me for 3 days, and now the transformation was nearly finished. I should have been panicking. I should have been fighting against this, resisting with everything I had. But instead I felt calm, curious, ready to see the pattern through to its conclusion. I pulled box 97. Inside, photographs. Dozens of them showing people in various locations, not just Underhill but other buildings, public spaces, everyday environments. And in each photo, someone was highlighted with a red circle, their face marked, their position noted. I recognized several of the locations. The coffee shop near my apartment, the library I sometimes visited, the grocery store I used weekly, and in each photo, circled in red, was me. The documentation had been tracking me for months. Long before I received this assignment, the Underhill Foundation had been monitoring my movements, my routines, my patterns of behavior. They'd identified me as a candidate for integration and had been waiting for the right opportunity to expose me to the geometry. A document at the bottom of the box explained. Subject: Vera Castellanos, age 34, occupation: data archaeologist, document restoration specialist, psychological profile: high detail orientation, pattern recognition aptitude, preference for solitary work. Exhibits signs of anxiety and social disconnection common to optimal integration candidates. Recommendation: suitable for geometric consciousness integration. Subject's existing cognitive patterns predispose her toward recognition and acceptance of spatial mathematics. Professional skills make her ideal for documentation processing, allowing natural exposure to pattern materials over extended time frame. Proposed approach: contract through standard channels for archive cataloging work. Subject will process Kemper materials sequentially, allowing gradual integration over 7-14 days. Facility geometry will support and accelerate the process. Intervention unnecessary. Subject will follow pattern naturally once exposed. Expected outcome: voluntary integration within 2 weeks. Subject will complete documentation project and express desire to remain in facility environment. Offer permanent position as archive curator, allowing continued exposure to pattern while maintaining functional work role. Alternative outcome: if subject resists integration, pattern will remain incomplete but active. Subject will experience geometric awareness in external environments, likely returning within 3-6 months seeking stable spatial framework. Except at that time. Probability of successful integration: 94%. They'd calculated it. Analyzed my psychology, predicted my response, designed an approach that would lead me naturally into the pattern without triggering sufficient resistance to disrupt the process. And they'd been correct. I was here in the final stages of integration, processing the last boxes in the sequence, my consciousness already beginning to perceive the geometric relationships underlying the building's structure. I should have felt violated. They'd manipulated me, tracked me, engineered my exposure to materials specifically selected to colonize my thinking. This was psychological warfare conducted through architecture and documentation. But the anger wouldn't come. The emotional response that should have accompanied this revelation felt distant, muted, as if my capacity for outrage had been disconnected from my capacity for understanding. The geometry was already holding me. The pattern had established itself in my consciousness, and now I experienced its effects directly. Stable awareness without emotional turbulence, clear perception without reactive judgment, presence without the exhausting need to maintain self-narrative. And it felt good, better than good. It felt like relief, like setting down a burden I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it was there. I pulled the final box, box 101. Inside, a letter addressed to me specifically. Dear Vera, by now you understand what's happening. You've processed enough material to recognize the pattern, absorbed enough of the geometry to feel its effects. You're probably experiencing a profound sense of calm, clarity, relief from the constant anxiety that has characterized your existence up to this point. This is not manipulation. This is recognition. You found something your consciousness was seeking without knowing it existed. The geometric framework we offer isn't foreign to you. It's what you've been approximating through your obsessive routines, your preference for structured environments, your compulsive need to organize and categorize information. You've been trying to create your own geometric stability, but you lacked the architectural knowledge to implement it effectively. We're simply offering you access to structures that already exist, spaces that can provide the support you've been unsuccessfully attempting to generate internally. You have a choice. You can leave Silverwood, return to your previous life, carry the incomplete pattern with you into environments that will feel increasingly chaotic and unsupported. You'll function. The integration isn't complete enough to prevent normal activity, but you'll be aware of what you're missing, conscious of the absence of geometric structure in everyday spaces. Or you can stay. We have a position available, curator of the Kemper collection. You would continue processing these materials, maintaining the archive, guiding other researchers through the documentation. You would work in this building, surrounded by properly calibrated geometry, your consciousness fully supported by spatial mathematics optimized for human awareness. The position includes housing. There are residential units on the second floor, designed according to the same principles as the archive rooms. You would live and work within the geometric framework, your entire existence supported by architecture that holds you without confining you. You don't have to decide immediately. Finish your documentation, process the remaining boxes, complete the pattern, then see how you feel about leaving. We think you'll find the decision makes itself. Dr. Helena Sayers, Director, Underhill Foundation. The letter included a contract. Job description, salary generous, benefits comprehensive, start date immediately upon acceptance. Everything legally proper, nothing coercive, just a straightforward employment offer. They weren't trying to trap me. They were simply providing an option, allowing me to choose the environment that best supported my consciousness. And the terrible thing, the truth I could no longer deny, was that I wanted to accept. Not because I'd been brainwashed or manipulated beyond my capacity for judgment, but because the pattern actually worked. The geometric framework actually provided something I needed, something I'd been missing my entire life without being able to name it. I thought about my normal existence, the constant low-level anxiety, the exhausting effort of maintaining routines and structures that always eventually collapsed, the loneliness of being someone who preferred solitary work because social interaction required too much energy. I thought about my studio apartment with its carefully organized spaces, my obsessive cataloging systems, my need to impose order on information because I couldn't find order in experience. I'd been trying to create geometric stability through behavior, and I'd been failing because behavior alone couldn't generate the spatial framework consciousness required. But here, in this building, surrounded by architecture designed according to mathematical principles I'd only begun to perceive, I felt supported, held, stable in a way I'd never experienced before. And wasn't that what everyone wanted? To feel secure, structured, relieved from the burden of constant self-maintenance. The geometry offered that, not through chemical intervention or psychological therapy, but through the fundamental reorganization of space, according to principles that aligned with how consciousness actually operated rather than how we pretended it operated. I sat with the contract for a long time, minutes or hours, I couldn't tell. Time felt different now, less linear, more like a static dimension I could perceive all at once rather than experience sequentially. Finally, I made my decision. I left the contract unsigned on the table. I packed my equipment, organized the completed documentation, made sure everything was properly cataloged and indexed. I'd fulfilled my professional obligation. The estate would receive a complete digital archive of Harrison Kemper's materials, fully searchable, properly documented. Then I walked to the door. The keycard reader was green. I swiped and the pneumatic seal released. I stepped into the corridor. The lights were normal now, pure white, standard fluorescent, no amber tint. The hallway maintained its correct dimensions, the door to reception exactly where it should be. Derek was at his desk, reading something on his computer screen. He looked up when I approached. "All finished?" he asked. "Documentation's complete. Digital files are on my laptop, organized according to the contract specifications." "Great, let me process your final checkout." He pulled up some form on his computer, typed for a moment. "You'll receive final payment within 5 business days, and there's a completion bonus. Hold on, let me check the amount." More typing. "Wow, that's substantial. Looks like the Kemper estate is very satisfied with your work." "Good." I paused, then asked, "Derek, how long have you worked here?" "Almost 2 years. Why?" "Do you like it?" He considered the question carefully. "It's a good job, quiet, steady, good benefits. Why do you ask?" "Just curious." I walked to my car, put my equipment in the trunk, sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Through the windshield I could see Silverwood Archive, that converted warehouse with its discreet bronze plaque, its carefully neutral facade. I could feel it now. The geometry, the spatial relationships, the mathematical framework underlying the building's structure. I could perceive it the way you might perceive music, not through conscious analysis, but through direct recognition of pattern. And I could feel its absence in the car, in the parking lot, in the sprawling commercial landscape surrounding the facility. Normal space felt thin now, unsupported, like existing in a vacuum without enough pressure to hold me together. The pattern was incomplete. I'd processed all the boxes, followed the sequence to its conclusion, but I hadn't made the final choice. Accept integration fully, or carry the partial pattern into external environments where it would remain active but unsatisfied. I started the car. I drove home. I went through the motions of normal life, showering, eating, responding to emails. But everything felt wrong, hollow, like performing actions that had lost their meaning. That night, I didn't dream about corridors or impossible buildings. I dreamed about numbers. Prime numbers, counted in sequence, their values relating to each other through equations I could see but not solve, mathematical relationships that felt significant but remained just beyond my understanding. I woke at 3:00 a.m., my apartment feeling like a cage. The walls were too close, the ceiling too low, the space organized according to principles that no longer made sense to me. I got up, made coffee, opened my laptop. I found Dr. Helena Sayers' email address in the Underhill Foundation's correspondence and composed a message. Dr. Sayers, I've completed the Kemper documentation. I'd like to discuss the curator position. When can we meet? Vera Castellanos. I hit send before I could reconsider. The response came 17 minutes later at 3:34 a.m. Vera, I'm glad you've reached out. Can you come to Silverwood tomorrow at 9:00 a.m.? We'll discuss the position and, if you're interested, begin the onboarding process. The geometry has been waiting for you. Helena. I closed my laptop and sat in the darkness of my apartment, feeling the absence of proper spatial support, the exhausting effort of maintaining consciousness without architectural framework. I knew what I was going to do, not because I'd been manipulated beyond my capacity for choice, but because the pattern actually worked, because the geometry actually provided something I needed. Because sometimes the trap is also the solution. That was 6 months ago. I'm writing this from my residence at Silverwood Archive, in a room designed according to Kemper's specifications. The space is exactly the right size, not too large, not too small, proportioned according to mathematical relationships that support rather than constrain consciousness. I work as the Kemper Collection Curator, processing new materials as the Underhill Foundation acquires them, guiding researchers through the documentation when they request access. Most researchers process a few boxes and leave, absorbing partial patterns they'll carry into external environments. A few, like me, recognize what they've found and choose to stay. We're not prisoners. We can leave whenever we want. The doors open, the keycard readers blink green. Nothing prevents our departure except the recognition that we've found something valuable here, something we can't replicate elsewhere. Derek is still at reception. He completed his own integration about 6 months before I arrived, though he maintains the appearance of being regular facility staff. It helps researchers feel comfortable, reduces anxiety about the building's true nature. I haven't been back to my old apartment. The Underhill Foundation handled the lease termination, collected my belongings, stored everything I might eventually want to retrieve. Not that I think I will. The things I accumulated in my previous life feel like artifacts from someone else's existence. I sleep well now, 8 hours exactly, synchronized with the other residents within a 15-minute window. I eat less, need less, experience less of the anxiety and restlessness that used to characterize my waking hours. And I understand the geometry. Not completely. I don't think anyone except Kemper achieved complete understanding, but enough to perceive how it functions, how it creates spatial relationships that support consciousness without demanding anything in return. Sometimes I think about Marcus Holly's, living in Underhill for the past 20 years, his consciousness held in perfect geometric equilibrium. I wonder if he's happy. If happy even applies to someone who exists in stable awareness without the emotional volatility that normally accompanies human consciousness. Sometimes I think about the researchers who will come after me, who will sit in archive room 7 processing boxes arranged in prime number sequences, gradually integrating into patterns they don't yet recognize as architectural rather than informational. And sometimes I think about writing this account, documenting my experience, warning others about what Silverwood really is. But who would believe it? Buildings don't integrate consciousness. Architecture doesn't manipulate awareness. Space is passive, neutral, just empty volume for human activity to occupy. Except it's not. Space has structure. Structure has mathematics. Mathematics has effects on consciousness. And once you understand that, once you've experienced properly calibrated geometry, you can't unknow it. The pattern is real. The geometry works. And it's spreading slowly, carefully, through facilities like Silverwood, through documentation that exposes people to Kemper's ideas, through architecture that implements his principles without announcing its purpose. This isn't a warning. I'm past believing anyone needs to be warned about something that actually helps them. This is a documentation, a record of how integration occurs, how consciousness recognizes and accepts geometric support, how buildings can provide frameworks that reduce rather than increase human suffering. And maybe, if you're reading this, you're already part of the pattern. Maybe you've encountered Kemper's geometry in buildings you've visited, spaces that felt unusually comfortable or strangely compelling. Maybe you've already begun integrating without recognizing the process. If so, don't resist. The pattern isn't hostile. It's offering you something you need, something you've been seeking without knowing it exists. The geometry has been waiting. And now so have I.